My name is Audrey Beaumont, and I was 31 years old when my younger brother tried to take everything my father built, and very nearly took me with it. I had spent 8 years as a paramedic with BC Emergency Health Services, responding to the worst moments of strangers' lives. Car wrecks on the Coquihalla, overdoses in the downtown east side, a toddler pulled from a backyard pool in Kelowna. I had seen people at the absolute edge of what the human body can survive, and I had learned to stay calm when everything around me was falling apart. I thought that training had made me unbreakable. I was wrong. It turns out there are certain kinds of damage that no amount of field experience prepares you for. The kind that comes from someone who used to share your cereal and steal your Halloween candy. My father passed on a Tuesday in February, 3 days after a second stroke took what the first one had left behind. He was 67. He had been a pipe fitter for 30 years, a quiet man who kept his hands busy and his opinions to himself, and he had spent the last decade of his life building up something small and solid, a property in the Fraser Valley, a 4-bedroom house on 2 acres outside of Abbotsford that he had bought before the market made that kind of thing impossible, and a modest RRSP that he had never once touched. He wasn't wealthy, but he was careful, and careful had amounted to something real. He left the house to me. Not entirely. The will was structured the way my father did most things, quietly and fairly. I was to receive the property outright, but I was required to pay my brother his share of the appraised value within 5 years. Our father's lawyer, a patient man named Mr. Bellew, Okafor, who had known my dad since they volunteered together at the Legion, explained it to us at his office in Langley 3 days after the funeral. The number on the appraisal was just over $800,000. My brother's share was $400,000, to be paid within 60 months. My brother's name is Callum. He's 28, 3 years younger than me, and he had been living in Toronto for the past 4 years with his girlfriend Renata. I had never particularly liked Renata. That sounds petty now, putting it that way, but it's the honest version. She was the kind of person who performed warmth so precisely that it took you a while to notice there was nothing underneath it. She called my father the sweetest man at the funeral and cried in a way that looked impressive from a distance. But she hadn't visited once in the 18 months he was declining. Neither had Callum, actually. I was the one who drove to Abbotsford every second weekend, who managed the home care schedule, who sat with him through the long gray afternoons when the words wouldn't come anymore. I'm not saying that to be a martyr. I'm saying it because it matters to what came next. We hadn't even cleared his kitchen properly when Callum sat down across from me in the living room and said very calmly that 5 years was an unreasonable timeline and he needed the money now, not some of it, all of it. I have obligations, Audrey, he said. You have to understand that. I told him I did understand, that I was committed to the timeline in the will and that I would begin exploring a mortgage to pay him out as soon as the estate was settled. Mr. Okafor had already advised me this was straightforward. Callum nodded like he was listening. Then Renata from the doorway said, "That house is worth almost $1 million. You work on an ambulance." She said it the way you'd point out a stain on someone's shirt, observationally, as if she weren't implying that I had no right to be standing in my own father's house. I asked them to leave. They did. I stood in my father's kitchen for a long time after their rental car backed out of the driveway, listening to the particular silence of a house that had recently lost its person. I found the folder 3 days later, when I was going through the filing cabinet in his bedroom. My father was meticulous about paperwork. Years of union forms and benefits documents had made him that way. The folder was labeled in his careful block printing simply C. Inside were 6 years of e-transfer confirmations, printed out on plain paper and dated by hand, money sent to Callum's account. Some were small, 300 here, 500 there. But there were larger ones too. A wire transfer for $12,000 when Callum's consulting business had a slow quarter, another $8,000 when he and Renata had a gap between leases. My father, who clipped grocery coupons and kept the heat at 19 degrees all winter, had quietly sent his son over $60,000 across 6 years. Not one of those transfers had ever been repaid. I sat on the edge of my father's bed and held that folder and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the hospital. Not just because of the money, but because I understood something in that moment that broke my heart clean in half. My father had known exactly who Callum was. He had known for years. And he had kept sending the money anyway, kept trying to hold the fence together because he was that kind of man. The calls started the week I got back to Vancouver. The first one came at 11:30 on a Sunday night. Callum, his voice was low, slightly unsteady, the cadence of a person who had rehearsed the speech but was rattling it off too fast. He told me he had borrowed money against an investment that hadn't worked out, that there were people he owed, that signing the house over to him and letting him deal with the sale proceeds was the only way out. He used the word desperate 4 times. He said Dad would have wanted them to help each other. I listened until he was done, then I said goodnight and ended the call. The next day it was Renata. She called from a different number, her voice warm and measured, concern dialed to exactly the right frequency. She told me she'd been reading about healthcare worker burnout, that she was worried about me, that the stress of managing a property on top of shift work was a lot for one person. She suggested I might benefit from simplifying. I wrote down the time, the number, and the summary of the conversation in a notebook I'd bought specifically for this purpose. Date, caller, content. I was a paramedic. I documented everything. The texts came next. Short ones, timed to land when I was either finishing a night shift or in the middle of sleep. Dad would be so ashamed of how you're handling this. You always had to be the favorite, didn't you? We know you manipulated him at the end. The whole family knows. I did not reply to any of them. I screenshotted everything. Then my aunt called. She lives in Prince George, my dad's older sister, and she is the kind of woman who means well in a way that can still cause real damage. She told me, haltingly, that Renata had reached out to her and that there was concern in the family, that I had taken advantage of Dad's condition in his final months, that I had influenced the will. I took a breath so slow and deliberate that my aunt asked if I was still on the line. I told her carefully that my father had been assessed as mentally competent by 2 physicians in the months before his death, that Mr. Okafor had documented this, and that if anyone was questioning the will's validity, they were welcome to pursue that through proper legal channels. Then I asked her how she was doing, how the winter had been up north, and we talked for another 15 minutes about her garden. When I hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the Safeway near my apartment and let myself feel the full weight of it. They were running a campaign, isolating me, corrupting the people who might otherwise be in my corner, building a narrative in which I was the villain of my own father's story. I had seen this dynamic before, actually, not in my personal life, but in the training around workplace harassment, the way certain patterns repeat themselves across different contexts. Identify, isolate, destabilize. I called Margot. Margot had been my father's neighbor for 11 years. She was 62, a retired RCMP corporal who had done 25 years with the detachment in Mission before she and her husband bought the property next to my dad's. She and my father had become genuinely close, the kind of slow, companionable friendship that forms between people who share a fence line for a decade. After my mother had passed, Margot had checked on him regularly, brought over soup when he was sick, driven him to his cardiology appointments when I couldn't get away from shift work. When I called her that night, she picked up on the second ring. I told her everything, the folder, the calls, the texts, my aunt. I didn't perform composure for her the way I had for everyone else. I just told her the truth, and my voice broke twice, and she let it. "Come down this weekend," she said. "We'll figure out what you actually need." I drove to Abbotsford on Saturday morning. Margot met me at my father's house with coffee in a thermos and a calm, practical competence that I had forgotten was possible to feel in another person's presence. We walked through the house together. She pointed out the things I'd been too close to see. A window latch on the ground floor that didn't catch properly. The motion sensor light at the back that had stopped working. The fact that there were only 2 keys to the property and I'd given one of them to Callum years ago. "You need a rekey," she said, not a question. We spent the afternoon doing what needed doing. She had contacts, a locksmith she trusted, a security company that did residential installs. By evening, there were new deadbolts on every exterior door, a camera at the front and another covering the driveway, and the motion light at the back was working again. We ate dinner at the kitchen table, the same table where I had done my grade 10 homework while my dad watched the Canucks, and Margot talked about my father in the easy, detailed way that people talk about someone they actually knew. She told me about the time he'd spent an entire afternoon helping her husband level a raised garden bed and refused to come in for lunch until it was perfect, about how he used to bring her seedlings from his greenhouse every spring. "He talked about you constantly," she said, "not in a braggy way. Just like you were the thing he was most sure about." I didn't cry, but it was close. Before she left, she put her hand on my arm and looked at me directly. "I promised your dad I'd keep an eye on this place," she said. "On both his kids, honestly. I feel like I let one of them drift too far." She shook her head slightly. "I'm not doing that again. You call me anytime, Audrey. Day or night, I'll be here." That promise, made in my father's kitchen by a woman who had earned every version of it, meant more to me than I had words for. 2 weeks of quiet followed. No calls, no texts. I let myself consider the possibility that they had backed off. It was a foolish thing to consider. On a Thursday evening in March, Callum called with a different voice entirely. The desperation was gone, replaced by something carefully modulated. Reasonable. Almost gentle. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that things had gotten out of hand, that he missed me. He asked if we could talk in person, somewhere neutral, somewhere familiar. He suggested the Tim Hortons on the edge of town near the house, where we used to go after hockey games when we were kids. Against everything I had documented in that notebook, I said yes. I walked in 7 minutes early. Callum was already there, so was Renata. She was sitting beside him with her hands wrapped around a large coffee, and the expression on her face when she saw me was so carefully arranged, sympathetic, open, slightly wounded, that I almost admired the precision of it. I sat down. I didn't take off my coat. Renata spoke first. She had clearly rehearsed it. She talked about family, about how much stress everyone was under, about how grief does things to people. Her voice was pitched at a level just loud enough that the table of retirees beside us could hear her if they were paying attention. I understood immediately. This was not a conversation. It was a performance, and the audience was everyone in that restaurant who knew my father's family. Then Callum leaned forward. His voice rose just slightly, enough to carry. "Audrey, we all know you were there at the end. We know you had access to him when he was vulnerable. The will is not going to hold up, and the longer you fight this, the worse it looks for you." I felt the blood move through me in one long, cold wave. He was not wrong about the audience. I could feel eyes. I could feel the specific discomfort of a small community watching something private become public. I looked at him, at both of them, at the stranger wearing my brother's face and the woman beside him who had calculated every word of this encounter. "I have documentation of every contact you've made with me since the funeral," I said. My voice was quiet and very even. "I have legal counsel, and Mr. Okafor has already been fully briefed. If you want to contest the will, you are absolutely entitled to do that, and I look forward to presenting our respective records to the court." I stood up. "Don't contact me again outside of proper legal channels," I said. Then I walked out. I made it to my car in the parking lot before my hands started shaking. I sat there for a few minutes, just breathing. Then I drove directly to Mr. Okafor's office and left a message with his assistant, and then I called Margot. The next 3 weeks were the worst kind of quiet. I went back to work, ran my shifts, came home. I slept badly. I kept the cameras on my laptop open, checking the driveway feed in Abbotsford at odd hours like I expected something, and couldn't say what. It came on a Saturday afternoon. Margot texted me at 2:14 p.m. "He's here. Black SUV. Him and her both." Knocked on the door. I've got my phone out. I was already in my car. I called Margot back immediately. She was calm, exact, 25 years of training in her voice. She told me Callum had tried the front door, found it locked, gone around back, had stood on the deck and looked in the windows for a full 2 minutes before she had appeared at her fence and told him, pleasantly, that the property now had a security system and she'd be happy to give him the monitoring company's number if he needed it. He had stared at her for a long moment, Renata had said something to him, low and sharp, and they had gone back to the car. "He's still parked at the end of the driveway," Margot said. "Don't let him in for any reason," I said. "I'm an hour out." "I know," she said. "I've already called a friend at the detachment. He's going to come by for a visit." I drove the Coquihalla doing exactly the speed limit, which is the most disciplined thing I have ever done in my life. When I pulled into the driveway, the black SUV was still there. Callum got out when he saw me. Renata stayed in the passenger seat. He looked ragged, unshaven, eyes slightly swollen, the look of a man who had not slept in a week. For one unguarded second, I saw him as he used to be, 13 years old, getting off the school bus in November rain. Then he opened his mouth. "You're going to sign the house over," he said. "I need $150,000 by the end of April or I'm done. You understand what I'm telling you? I'm finished." I told him the property was not being signed over. I told him the process outlined in the will would be followed. I told him he needed to leave. He took a step forward, then another. And then something shifted in his face. The last of whatever had been holding it together simply gave way, and he grabbed my arm. What followed happened fast and badly. He shoved me against the side of my car. The door handle caught me hard across the back of my ribs. He was bigger than me, and he was past the point of rational thought, and the thing I keep returning to is how strange it felt to apply my training to my own brother, to actually have to defend myself from him. I got hold of the door frame, got some space between us. He swung and connected with my shoulder hard enough to spin me. I went down on one knee on the gravel. And then I heard Renata's window roll down. "Just take the keys from her, Callum," she said. Her voice was completely level. "She can't stop you. Take the keys and go inside." She said it the way you tell someone to take an umbrella. And that was the moment. Renata's voice, that flat and absolute calm, the complete absence of any human response to watching someone she'd known for years on her knees in a driveway, when I understood exactly what I was dealing with. I heard a vehicle coming up the road. Margot's friend from the detachment, a corporal named Whitfield, turned out to be two cruisers. They pulled in with their overhead lights going. Callum let go of me immediately and stepped back, and I watched his face as the reality of what he had just done arranged itself across his features. Margot was right behind them in her pickup truck. She had her phone in her hand, camera facing outward, and she'd been recording since Callum grabbed me. "I got the whole thing," she said, coming to stand beside me. Her voice was so steady. "From the moment he put his hands on you." Callum was arrested that afternoon. Renata was detained and questioned. The charges included assault and, once Margot's video was reviewed, mischief and forcible entry for the earlier attempt on the back door. By the time Mr. Okafor arrived, which he did within the hour, we had a police report, documented footage, and a formal record of the pattern of harassment going back 6 weeks. I was treated in Abbotsford at the regional hospital, 2 bruised ribs, significant bruising across my back and shoulder. The doctor who saw me had the careful, practiced manner of someone accustomed to seeing injuries that weren't accidental. She asked if I was safe. I told her I was now. From the hospital bed, my first coherent thought was the same one it always is after a bad call. What do I need to document? I asked the nurse for paper and a pen. I wrote everything down. 6 weeks of contact in order, with dates and approximate times. The financial history from the folder. The campaign against my reputation with the family. The encounter at Tim Hortons. The driveway. I wrote 10 pages. And when Mr. Okafor arrived, he read them without speaking. And when he was done, he looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Audrey, you've done the hard part already. Now let me do mine." The preliminary hearing was 4 months later. I wore my uniform. Not the paramedic uniform, but the dress version I wore for public events, the one with the service pin I'd received after 5 years. It wasn't a calculated choice, not entirely. It was just that I'd spent weeks feeling like I'd had my identity used against me, and I wanted to walk into that room as exactly who I was. Callum looked like he had aged badly in 4 months. Renata had retained separate counsel and was clearly working on a strategy that involved minimal eye contact with anyone. The prosecutor presented the case methodically and without drama, which is the best way to present evidence that speaks for itself. Margot's video, the screenshots of the texts, projected onto the screen in the courtroom, the e-transfer records from my father's folder, establishing the history of financial dependency and the motive behind the assault, my documented timeline, phone logs, the Zillow listing. Yes, they had found a Zillow equivalent. Callum had arranged for someone from a Toronto brokerage to access the property and list it on a real estate platform without my knowledge or consent. That detail, when it came out, produced a visible reaction in the jury. The defense tried, predictably, to suggest I had been the aggressor, that I had provoked the incident, that my work in emergency services had given me a distorted relationship with conflict. I was asked on cross-examination whether it was true that paramedics were trained to respond to violence. I looked at the jury. Yes, I said, we're trained to respond to violence that happens to other people. I've never had to use that training on my own family. The jury took less than an afternoon. Guilty. Assault causing bodily harm. Mischief. Uttering threats. Renata was convicted on a reduced charge. Her lawyer had negotiated, but she was convicted. Walking out of that courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the way I feel at the end of a long shift, emptied out and glad it was over and not entirely sure what to do with the quiet. My Aunt Carol was in the gallery. She had come down from Prince George, which I hadn't expected. She waited for me outside, and when I came through the doors, she put both arms around me without saying anything. When she pulled back, her eyes were red. "I should have known better," she said. "I should have trusted what I knew about you." I told her I understood. I meant it. It took me 3 months after the trial to really use the house again. Margot had arranged for it to be cleaned and aired out, and neighbors had come one weekend in a way that reminded me sharply of something I'd heard about in other people's stories but had never experienced directly, the way a community can move to repair a thing without being asked. They replaced the gravel in the driveway, which still had a faint dark stain I couldn't stop seeing. They brought food. A man 2 properties down who had known my father for 20 years brought a flat of snowdrops and planted them along the front walk. I stayed there the first night and I did not sleep well. But I stayed. A letter arrived 6 weeks later. Return address, a federal correctional institution in Ontario, Callum. I opened it because I had decided I would, not out of hope, but because I needed to close what needed closing. The letter was long. He was sorry. He had been under impossible pressure. Renata had pushed him further than he would ever have gone on his own. The crypto investments were real, the losses catastrophic, the debt to people he didn't name had terrified him in ways he couldn't explain. He said he didn't know how things had gotten so far. He said he thought about Dad all the time. Not once did he say, "I was wrong," full stop, without conditions. I read every page. Then I put it in the folder labeled C, which I had kept, and I filed it. Forgiveness was something I was going to have to work toward, slowly, the way you work toward anything that requires you to change rather than just endure. I had started seeing someone through the EAP program, a therapist in Vancouver who worked with first responders, a woman who had clearly spent many years learning to hear what people weren't saying. In our sessions, I kept coming back to the question my aunt had asked me in a roundabout way at the courthouse, whether I would ever let Callum back in. "There's a difference," my therapist told me, "between forgiving someone and restoring access. The first is for you. The second is a separate decision entirely, and you're not obligated to make it." I wrote that down and put it on the fridge. I started spending weekends in Abbotsford. In the spring, I found my father's tools in the garage, still organized the way he kept them, and I started using them. I was a disaster at first. My hands knew how to start an IV line on a moving ambulance, not how to use a hand plane. But I kept at it. I built a raised garden bed, badly, and then a better one. I rebuilt a section of the fence along the east side of the property that had been sagging for years. Margot came over to supervise and offered opinions I did not ask for, and it was the best company I'd had in months. In August, I found a small envelope tucked into the back of my father's toolbox. It was addressed to me in his handwriting. He had written it, based on the date, 3 weeks before his first stroke. "Audrey, I know I'm not always good at saying the things that matter. You have always been the one who shows up, not because I asked, just because that's who you are. Whatever happens with the house, with any of it, that's not what I'm proud of. I'm proud of what you built in yourself. Don't spend your life guarding what I left. Go build your own things. Love, Dad. I read it twice, sitting on an overturned bucket in his garage with sawdust on my jeans and the smell of cedar all around me. That fall, I made a decision. I kept the house. Not as a fortress, not as a monument, but as a place, a useful, living place. I opened the property up 2 Saturdays a month to a program I'd connected with through the paramedic service, veterans and first responders doing woodworking and building projects as a form of structured decompression. The research on it was solid. Working with your hands in community with something that required focus and produced a real object. It was therapeutic in a way that was measurable and didn't feel like therapy. Margot helped me set it up. Of course she did. On the first Saturday in November, 8 people showed up. A firefighter from Chilliwack who hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 2 years. A former CF medic who had done 2 rotations in Afghanistan and was now working in a grocery warehouse because the sound of the emergency tones had become unbearable. A woman who had been a first responder for 12 years and had recently taken leave. We built birdhouses that day. Unglamorous, practical, useful. By noon, the garage was full of the sound of hammers and the smell of pine, and somebody had brought a speaker playing something old and low-key, and people were talking. Just talking. About the work, about small things. I stood in the doorway of my father's garage and looked at it. This room that still smelled like him, now full of people finding their way back to something, and I understood what he had meant. Not the house. This. My father's legacy was never the property. It was the particular way he showed up for people, quietly, without expectation, and how that quiet kept making things possible long after he was gone. I hadn't just fought to keep the house, I had fought to understand what it was for. And finally, standing in November light with sawdust on my boots and the sound of my father's people working in his space, I knew. The thing I keep coming back to, now that it's over, is that folder in my father's filing cabinet. The one labeled C in his neat block printing. 6 years of transfers, printed and dated by hand, quietly documenting a generosity that was never returned and never once complained about. My father knew what my brother was, he had known for a long time, and he kept showing up anyway, not because he was naive, but because that was simply what he understood it meant to be a decent person. He gave without keeping score, he asked for nothing back. That quality, that basic integrity in how he moved through the world, was what I was actually fighting to protect. Not the square footage, not the appraised value. Him. I think about Callum and Renata a lot. In the way you think about things that still don't fully make sense. The greed wasn't hard to understand. Debt is real, desperation is real, and I have seen enough of what financial pressure does to people to know it can hollow out the judgment of someone who might otherwise have been fine. What I couldn't understand, and still can't entirely, was the calculation. The phone calls timed to land when I was coming off a night shift. The performance at the Tim Hortons, the audience deliberately chosen, the accusations pitched to Carrie. That wasn't desperation. That was something colder, and it took a clear head and the documented record to make sure it didn't work. I had to be smart about it. That's the part I didn't expect to need. I went in thinking I just had to hold the line, and what I discovered was that holding the line required keeping evidence, understanding the legal process, anticipating what they would do next, and not letting the emotional weight of it knock me off balance long enough to make a mistake. The notebook? The screenshots? The 9 pages I wrote from a hospital bed with bruised ribs and a concussion? None of that was dramatic. It was just disciplined. And it was the discipline, in the end, that gave Mr. Okafor something to work with, and gave Margot's video its context. And Margot. I think about what this story would have looked like without her, and I genuinely don't know. She showed up with a thermos and a toolbox on a Saturday night because she had made a promise to my father, and she kept it without being asked. She drove to the detachment contact on her own initiative. She stood at the fence with her phone out in a way that changed the outcome of that afternoon entirely. There is a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that just quietly acts when it's needed, and I want to carry that forward. I want to be the person who shows up with the thermos. What I understand now, standing on the other side of all of it, is that my father's letter was right. The house was never the legacy. The legacy was the way he chose to be, consistent, honest, generous without expectation, and the way that choice rippled outward into other people's lives long after he was gone. Margot's loyalty to me was really a reflection of who he was. The neighbors planting snowdrops in November were really honoring him. The workshop full of first responders finding their way back to something, that was him too. I couldn't change what happened. I couldn't make my brother into someone different, couldn't undo the months of harassment or the afternoon in the driveway. But I could choose what I built from it. That choice, what you do with the wreckage, how you carry it forward, turns out to be the only thing that's actually yours. It's enough. It has to be. And most days it is.